Chapter 34, Yosef, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 19 days from home. Yosef wished he was invisible. Once the rest of the passengers discovered who had jumped overboard yesterday, everyone stopped to tell him how sorry they were, how everything would be all right. But how could it be all right? How could it ever be all right? Yosef stood at the rail on A deck where his father had jumped. Down below, the sea was no longer empty. It was dotted with little motorboats and rowboats. Some carried reporters, shouting up questions, trying to get pictures of the ship. Other boats offered up bunches of fresh bananas and bags of coconuts and oranges. Passengers on sea deck tossed money down, and the fruit was passed up by ladder by the Cuban policemen guarding the top and the bottom. Lately, though, the boats were full of relatives of people on board, mostly men. They had come ahead to Cuba to get jobs and find places for their families to live. One man brought the same little white dog every day and held it up for his wife to wave to. The boats with relatives came close enough for their families to yell back and forth a little, but they couldn't get any closer. Thanks to Yosef's father, a handful of Cuban police boats now surrounded the St. Louis. They kept the rescue ships at a distance and watched for anyone else who tried to jump to freedom or death. At night, the Cuban police boats swept the hull with searchlights, and the St. Louis crew members, on the captain's orders, patrolled the decks on suicide watch. "Eveline, there he is. There's Papa," Renata cried. She stood a few paces away from Yosef down the rail, trying to point out one of the little rowboats to her sister. "Where? I don't see him," Eveline whined. Yosef was more interested in the small police boat that had navigated its way through the flotilla and was pulling up to the St. Louis. Anytime they had a visitor now, it was cause for conversation, and soon word spread throughout the ship that the boat had brought the Cuban policeman who had saved Yosef's father. Yosef ran down to fetch his mother and sister, and together they hurried to the social hall, where a group of passengers and crew gathered to give the Cuban policeman a hero's welcome. They parted for the policeman, cheering and slapping him on the back and shaking hands with him as he went. It was the first time he had been back to the ship since jumping overboard to save Yosef's father, and Yosef and his family strained to get a good look at him over the heads of the other passengers. Yosef's mother cried and put a hand to her mouth, and Yosef felt a surge of affection for the policeman. This was a man who had saved his father's life. The policeman seemed genuinely flattered and surprised by all the attention. He was a short, stocky man with olive skin, a wide face, and a thick mustache. He wore blue pants, a gray shirt with epaulettes on the shoulders, and a matching gray beret. Around his waist was a leather belt with a nightstick and holster hanging from it. His name, they were told, was Mariano Padron. Captain Schroeder arrived to thank Officer Padron on behalf of the passengers and crew. Yosef felt a ripple of tension spread throughout the room. Yosef had seen the captain less and less as the hot days of waiting at anchor dragged on, and he wasn't the only passenger who had noticed. But they were there to celebrate Officer Padron, not badger the captain about why they were still on the ship. The mood became happy again when the policeman was presented with a gift of 150 Reichsmarks that had been collected from grateful passengers. Officer Padron was stunned, and so was Yosef. 150 Reichsmarks was a lot of money, especially for people who might need that money later to pay for visas and entrance fees. Officer Padron tried to refuse the money, but the passengers wouldn't hear of it. "I was just doing my job," Officer Padron told the audience through a translator, "but I will never forget this. I will never forget any of you. Thank you." The passengers applauded again, and while many of them turned their attention to the captain to ask him for a status report, Yosef and his mother and sister pushed forward to talk to the policeman. Officer Padron's eyes lit up at the sight of Yosef's mother. He said something in Spanish, and the passenger who had spoken for him in front of the crowd smiled and translated his words. "Senora, your father was a thief?" Yosef's mother frowned. "A thief? My father? No, I don't understand." "Your father, he must be a thief," Officer Padron said through the translator, "because he stole the stars from the sky and put them in the Senora's eyes." Yosef finally understood. It was some kind of compliment about how pretty she was. His mother smiled politely but impatiently. Officer Padron, what about my husband? She asked. Is he all right? They won't let me go ashore and see him. The policeman took off his hat. I am so sorry, so very sorry, Signora Landau. Yes, your husband is alive, he said through the interpreter. He is in the hospital. He has been. Officer Padron said something more, but the translator frowned. It was beyond his limited Spanish. Officer Padron could see his confusion, and he pantomimed what he meant by turning his wrists upside down, closing his eyes, and lolling his head back like he was asleep. Sedated, Mama said. There was pain in her voice. Yosef knew she blamed herself. The whole reason her husband was gone was because she had been sedated and unable to stop him. Officer Padron nodded. It's not good, he said through the interpreter, but he will live. Yosef's mother took both the policeman's hands in her own and kissed them. Thank you, Officer Padron. She spoke in German, but the policeman seemed to understand. He blushed and nodded. Then he spied Ruthie, half hidden behind his mother's skirt, and knelt down to her. He put his policeman's beret on her head and said something in Spanish, and she smiled. He says, you're the policewoman now, the translator said. He will be the criminal. You must catch him. Officer Padron led Ruthie on a merry chase around the room, Ruthie squealing. Yosef's mother laughed through a sob. It was the first time Yosef had heard her laugh or seen her smile in months. Officer Padron let Ruthie catch him, and he plucked the hat off Ruthie's head and put it on Yosef's head, speaking in Spanish again. He says, it's your turn, the translator said. Oh no, Yosef said. He waved a hand to make sure the policeman understood. He wasn't in the mood for fun and games, and besides, he was too old for that kind of thing. Officer Padron tapped Yosef's chest with the back of his hand, urging him to play. He says he is the passenger, the translator said. Officer Padron raised himself up in mock anger and spoke in Spanish. You, Senor Policeman, the translator said, when will we leave the ship? The happy mood suddenly disappeared. Yosef and his family and the translator all looked at each other awkwardly. Officer Padron had only meant to mimic what everyone asked him all the time, but the question made Yosef sag. It felt like they were never getting off this ship. Officer Padron realized his mistake immediately and looked anguished at having brought it up. He nodded in sympathy. Then, in unison, he and Yosef spoke the answer all the Cuban guards always give, mañana. Chapter 35, Isabelle, somewhere between the Bahamas and Florida, 5 days from home. Isabelle slipped over the side of the boat into the sea inside. The water was warm, but it felt much cooler than being in the boat. The sun was just setting on the western horizon, turning the world into a sepia-toned photograph, but it still had to be close to 100 degrees outside. If it wouldn't have swamped their boat and drowned them all for good, Isabelle would have prayed for rain to break the muggy heat. Isabelle's father had rigged up a makeshift sunshade out of his shirt for her and her mother, and she seemed better now. The aspirin had kept Mommy's fever down, and though she was still exhausted and near to bursting with Isabelle's baby brother, she seemed at peace somehow. Hot, but at peace. If the rest of them wanted relief, they had to wait for their turn in the water. Again, Isabelle thought about their journey as a song. If the riots and trading for gasoline were the first verse, and the tanker and the storm the second verse, this part of their trip, the long, hot, stagnant day and a half they had been traveling from the Bahamas to Florida, this was the bridge. A third verse that was different from the others. This verse was death by slow measures. This was the down-tempo lull before the coming excitement of the climactic last verse and coda. This was limbo. They could do nothing but wait. The last sliver of sun finally disappeared below the waves, and Louise cut the engine. The world went silent, but for the soft lapping of water against the lull, and the creak of their disintegrating boat. That's it, Louise said. With the sun down, we won't be able to navigate as well. Can we use the stars? Isabelle asked. She remembered reading that sailors had used the stars to navigate for centuries. Which one? Louise asked. None of them knew. Amara lifted one of the gasoline jugs and swished around what little there was left in it. Saves us gas anyway, she said. That thing's been eating it up. We'll be lucky to have enough to get to shore when we see land. When will we get there? Yvonne asked. He was bobbing in the water just ahead of Isabelle, hanging on to the hull like she was. Tomorrow, hopefully, Senor Castillo said from inside the boat. It was the same thing he'd said yesterday, and the day before that. Mañana, Isabelle's grandfather whispered. He was treading water on the other side of the boat with Senora Castillo, his head just visible over the side. He'd been whispering that word off and on since yesterday, and still seemed shaken up somehow. Isabelle didn't know why. We'll see the lights of Miami sometime tomorrow, and we'll head straight for it, Mommy said. She shifted and winced uncomfortably. What is it? Are you all right? Poppy asked. Isabelle's mother put a hand on her belly. I think it's begun. What's begun? Poppy asked. Then his eyes went wide. You mean the baby's coming? Here? Now? Everyone in the boat perked up, and Isabelle and Yvonne pulled themselves up on the side of the boat to see. Isabelle was a jumble of emotions. She was excited to see her brother born, after waiting so long, but suddenly she was also afraid. Afraid for her mother to have the baby here, on this fragile raft in the middle of the ocean. And worried, too, for the first time about how her baby brother would change her fragile family. Yes, I think I've gone into labor, Isabelle's mother said calmly. But no, I'm not having the baby here and now. The contractions are just starting. It took Isabelle another 10 hours to come after my contractions began, remember? Isabelle had never heard her mother talk about her birth before, and she was both curious and a little weirded out at the same time. What are you going to name him? Yvonne asked. Mommy and Poppy looked at each other. We haven't decided yet, she said. Well, I have some good ideas if you want some, Yvonne said. We're not naming him after the Industrials players, Isabelle told him, and Yvonne stuck his tongue out at her. They were all quiet for a time, and Isabelle watched as the golden horizon shifted from orange to purple to deep blue. Would her baby brother be born at sea or in the United States? Would the end of their song really be a new life in Miami? Or would it all end in tragedy for them, adrift, out of gas, and dying of thirst in the great saltwater desert of the Atlantic? Hey, we never named our boat, Yvonne said. Everyone moaned and laughed. What? Yvonne said, smiling. Every good boat needs a name. I think we all agree this isn't a good boat, Senor Castillo said. But it's the boat that's taking us to the States, to freedom, Yvonne said. It deserves a name. How about Fidel? Luis joked, kicking up a splash on Castor's face at the bottom of the boat. No, Poppy said. El ataud flotante, the floating coffin. Isabelle winced at the name. It wasn't funny, not with her mother about to have a baby on the boat. Too close, Senor Castillo agreed. How about me piro? He suggested. It was slang for I'm out of here in Cuba. Ciao, Pascal, Mummy said, and everyone laughed. It literally meant goodbye, fish, but everyone in Cuba said it to each other to say goodbye. The St. Louis, Isabelle's grandfather said softly. Everyone was quiet for a moment, trying to figure out the joke, but no one understood. How about el camello? Luis said. The camel was what they called the ugly humpbacked buses pulled around by tractors in Havana. No, I've got it, Amaro cried. El botero. It was perfect, because it was slang word for the taxis in Havana, but it actually meant the boatman, and all the adults laughed and clapped. No, Yvonne said, frustrated. It needs a cool-sounding name, like the... Yvonne jumped a little in the water, and his eyes went wide. The what? Isabelle asked. Then she jumped too, as something hard and leathery bumped into her leg. Shark! Isabelle screamed. Shark! Screamed Isabelle's grandfather from the other side of the boat. The water around Yvonne became a dark red cloud, and Isabelle screamed. Something bumped into her again, and Isabelle scrambled to climb into the boat, arms and legs shaking, panic thundering in her chest. Her father grabbed her around her middle, and they fell back in a tumble inside the boat. Beside them, Amara and Mommy helped pull Senora Castillo into the boat as Lido pushed her up out of the water from behind. Isabelle and her father scrabbled to their knees and pulled her grandfather in behind her. On the other side of the boat, Luis and Senor Castillo cried out Yvonne's name as they hauled his limp body up over the side. Yvonne's right leg was a bloody mess. There were small bites all over it, as though a gang of sharks had attacked all at once. Raw, red, gaping wounds exposed the muscle under his skin. Isabelle fell back against the side of the boat in horror. She'd never seen anything so awful. She felt like she was going to throw up. Senora Castillo wailed. Yvonne was so shocked he didn't even cry out, didn't speak. His eyes had a glazed look to them, and his mouth hung open. One of the gashes up near his thigh was pumping blood out like a garden hose, and Isabelle watched as Yvonne's face grew pale. She couldn't speak. "A tourniquet," Lido cried. "We have to get something around his leg to stop the bleeding." Isabelle's father yanked off his belt, and Lido tied it high around Yvonne's leg as he could, but the blood still flowed, coloring the water all around them in the boat, a dark, sickening red. "No, no!" Senor Castillo cried, as the life went out of Yvonne's eyes. Isabelle wanted to scream too, but she was frozen. There was nothing she could do. There was nothing any of them could do. Yvonne was dead. Luis yelled in rage and pulled his police pistol from its holster. Bang, bang, bang. He fired. Once, twice, 3 times at the fin that circled the boat. "No," Lito said, grabbing Luis's hand before he could shoot again. "You'll just bring more sharks with the blood in the water." Too late. Another fin appeared, and another. And soon, the nameless little boat was surrounded. They were trapped in their own sinking prison. Chapter 36. Mahmoud, Lesbos, Greece to Athens, Greece, 2015, 12 days from home. Mahmoud was in another tent city. The paved parking lot at the pier in Lesbos was full of the kinds of camping tents sold in sporting goods stores. Round-topped, single-family tents of blue and green and white and yellow and red, all provided by Greek relief workers who knew the refugees had nowhere to stay while they waited for the ferry to Athens to come. Wet clothes were hung out to dry on bicycle racks and traffic signs, and refugees gathered around camp stoves and hot plates. It should have been a lively place, full of songs and laughter, like the Kilis refugee camp, but instead a soft, mournful murmur of conversation hung over the tent city like a fog. Mahmoud wasn't surprised. His family felt exactly the same way. They all should have been excited to finally be in Greece, to be allowed to buy real tickets to travel on an actual ferry to mainland Europe. But too many of them had lost someone in the sea crossing to be happy. Mahmoud's mother had gone from tent to tent asking after Hannah. Mahmoud had helped. It was his fault she was gone after all. But no one at the dock had her, and no one had been on the dinghy that had taken her. Refugees came and went, but their tents remained, and Mahmoud's mother insisted they miss the next ferry to Athens so she could ask each new round of refugees for word of her daughter, but no one knew anything about her. Mahmoud felt sick as sick as he had on the dinghy. He couldn't look at his mother. She had to blame him for losing Hannah. He certainly blamed himself. He couldn't sleep at night. He kept picturing his sister's dinghy bursting on the rocks, Hannah falling into the water, none of them there to help her. Mahmoud's mother wanted to stay at the dock longer, didn't want to leave without knowing what happened to Hannah, but Dad told her they had to move on. There was no telling when the ferry line might suddenly decide to stop selling tickets to refugees, or when Greece might decide to send them all home. They had to keep moving, or they would die. Hannah had to have gone ahead of them on the morning ferry they'd missed that first day, or else. No one wanted to think about the or else. The huge Athens ferry arrived again that morning. It was the length of a soccer field, and at least 5 stories tall. The bottom half of it was painted blue, and the Blue Star Ferries was written in big words on the side. A radar bar spun near the bridge, and antennas and satellites and dishes sprouted from the roof. It looked like the pictures Mahmoud had seen of cruise ships. Its lifeboats alone were bigger than the dinghy they had left in Turkey. Mahmoud tried to get Walid interested in the big ship, to get him excited about their first trip on a boat that big, but his little brother didn't care. He didn't seem to care about anything. A big ramp on the back lowered, and refugees streamed on board the ferry. Mahmoud's mother wept as they climbed a ramp with the other passengers. She kept looking back over her shoulder at the tent city, hoping Mahmoud was sure to catch a glimpse of someone carrying a baby who might be Hannah, but she never did. The inside of the ferry was like a lobby of a fancy hotel. Every floor had little clusters of glass tables and white upholstered chairs. Snack bars sold chips and sweets and sodas, and televisions played a Greek soccer game. Refugees who still had belongings stuffed their backpacks and trash bags under tables and into the overhead compartments. Mahmoud and his family settled into one of the booths, and his father searched for a plug to charge his phone. Mahmoud, why don't you take your brother and explore the ship? Dad told him. Mahmoud was only too glad to get away from the sight of his mother's broken face, and he took Walid by the hand and pulled him out onto the promenade that ran around the outside of the ship. Mahmoud and Walid watched silently as the ferry pulled away from the dock, the ship's huge engines thrumming deep below them. The awful sea that had tried to swallow them was calm and sapphire blue now. The Greek island of Lesbos was actually beautiful when you saw it from the sea. Little white buildings with terracotta roofs rose up tree-covered hills, and on top of one of the hills was an ancient gray castle. Mahmoud could see why people visited there on vacation. Besides the refugees, there were a number of tourists on board. Mahmoud could tell they weren't refugees because they wore clean clothes and used their phones for taking pictures instead of looking up overland routes from Athens to Macedonia. Another refugee had lain out a mat on the deck, and he was praying. In all the bustle of waiting in line and getting on board, Mahmoud had lost track of what time it was. He pulled his brother down with him to pray alongside the man. As he knelt and stood, Mahmoud was supposed to be focused only on his prayers, but he couldn't help notice the uneasy looks the tourists were giving them. The frowns of displeasure, like Mahmoud and his brother and this man were doing something wrong. The vacationers dropped their voices, and even though Mahmoud couldn't understand what they were saying, he could hear the disgust in their words. This wasn't what the tourists had paid for. They were supposed to be on the holiday, seeing ancient ruins and beautiful Greek beaches, not stepping over filthy praying refugees. They only see us when we do something they don't want us to do, Mahmoud realized. The thought hit him like a lightning bolt. When they stayed where they were supposed to be, in the ruins of Aleppo or behind the fences of a refugee camp, people could forget about them. But when the refugees did something they didn't want them to do, when they tried to cross the border into their country, or slept on the front stoops of their shops, or jumped in front of cars, or prayed on the decks of their ferries, that's when people couldn't ignore them any longer. Mahmoud's first instinct was to disappear below the decks, to be invisible. Being invisible in Syria had kept him alive, but now Mahmoud began to wonder if being invisible in Europe might be the death of him and his family. If no one saw them, no one could help them. And maybe the world needed to see what was really happening here. It was hard not to see the refugees in Athens when Mahmoud got there. Syrians were everywhere in the streets and hotels and markets, most of them, like Mahmoud's family, planning to move on as soon as they could. Mahmoud's father thought he had the right documents to travel freely in Greece, but a woman at an immigration office told him he would need to go to a local police station first and get an official document, and the police told him he would have to wait up to a week. "We can't wait a week," Mahmoud's father told his family. They had found a hotel for €10 a night per person, and the people of Athens were very friendly and helpful. But Mahmoud knew his parents only had so much money, and they still had 4 more countries to cross before they reached Germany. Mahmoud's mother would have stayed a week or even longer to keep asking everyone she met if they had seen a baby named Hannah. But it was decided they would take a train to the border of Macedonia and try to sneak across during the night.